Constitutional Liberalism in France. 1. Introduction. When Madame de Staël wrote her Considérations sur our Évolution française, one of the central questions she raised was the following. Did France possess a constitution before the Revolution? De Staël 2008 pp. 96 o 111. Her answer was that France had been governed by custom, by caprice, but never by laws, and that of all modern monarchies France had undoubtedly been the one whose political institutions had been the most arbitrary. This is a portrayal that France's monarchs might have challenged. They certainly felt themselves to be constrained in their actions by a set of fundamental laws that they might not transgress, but the fact remained that by 1789, there existed a widespread demand for a written constitution that would set out clear limits to the actions of government and that would define the rights of all citizens. It was in this context that the meaning attributed to the idea of a constitution changed irrevocably and with radical implications. Henceforth, it was to be understood as the set of arrangements that were to determine the manner in which institutions of the state and of public authority operated. Moreover, given the descent of the monarchy into what was widely perceived to be despotism, the demand was increasingly made that these arrangements should correspond to the deliberate choice of the nation. What form this constitution was to take and how the views of the nation were to be expressed were questions that were to preoccupy France's legislators for much of the next decade. These passionate and immensely sophisticated debates were to be decisive in shaping much of France's future political history, in part for the simple reason that they were premised upon an outright rejection of the claim that the monarch alone embodied the sovereign public will, that doctrine widely propagated by the crown itself, in its struggles with the parliaments, had made sense in the context of a society which was both divided and parcelized, and where therefore it appeared that not only was a strong state necessary in order to secure civil peace, but where also that state could claim to embody the generality as opposed to the particularity of society's interests. The preoccupation, as witnessed in the writings of Bossuet and many others, had been at one and the same time that of denying that sovereignty had its origins in the people and of seeking to render royal power more truly public. Seen thus, la monarchie absolute positioned itself as an instrument calculated to enhance, rather than to diminish, the liberty and security of the individual. From this followed a suspicion of all those intermediary powers and voluntary associations that later French liberals were to consider as one of the all-important guarantees of liberty. Even when defended by Montesquieu, such institutions came to be conflated with aristocratic power and what became known as the vis nobiliaire. In the summer of 1789, a dramatic transfer of power took place, with the newfound political and ideological ascendancy of the Third Estate receiving its clearest articulation in the writings and speeches of the Abbé Sieyes. For CES, the only legitimate source of power was located in the nation. All other forms were contrary to the common interest. The problem remained, however, of providing institutional expression for that power. Initially, the intellectual leadership of the revolution fell to those who became known as the monarchians. They showed themselves to possess a perceptive awareness of the dangers of arbitrary government, be it in the form of the despotism of either a single individual or of the multitude. They recommended representative as opposed to direct democracy, advocating the establishment of a two-chamber parliamentary system so constructed as to give voice to the diverse interests of the whole country and to secure sound and responsible legislation. Similarly, the monarchians proposed the separation of executive and legislative power. In order to avoid tyranny, Jean-Joseph Mounier argued, it is absolutely indispensable to ensure that the power to make laws is not in the hands of those who implement them. 1. In short, they argued that the preservation of individual liberty demanded the division of sovereignty, and that this could best be achieved by a system of representative and constitutional government. seeking to draw upon the experience of the past rather than to reason from first principles. Their constant point of reference was the English Constitution. The institutions of government, Mounier further opined, had to take into account the weakness and the passions of men. By the late summer of 1789, the proposals of the monarchians, in particular, the call for a two-chamber parliamentary system, had been overwhelmingly rejected. The prevailing view was that as France had now been divested of privilege and of the aristocratic prejudices of the past, there was no need for a system designed to accommodate diverse and conflicting interests. What size, asked rhetorically, had the nation possessed of a unitary will to fear from itself? Rabot Saint-Étienne set out the institutional logic which applied to such a situation. Given that the power to govern itself belonged to the nation in its entirety, his sovereign is a single, simple thing, since it is made up of the collective whole without exception. Therefore, legislative power is single and simple, and if the sovereign cannot be divided, nor can legislative power. Point 2. The same logic informed the conviction that legislation was not to be subject to judicial review. The framers of the new political order deliberately set out to weaken the capacity of the judiciary to curtail the legislative and executive branches, largely on the grounds that sovereignty, one and indivisible, could be located in the will of the citizens alone as articulated through the single-chamber National Assembly. How might these important developments be summarized? First, break ing with the traditions and practices of the Ancien Regime, it was quickly established that a constitution should have a clearly written and coherent form. Its authors were to be the nation acting as sovereign through its representatives. Next, although in form a monarchy, the constitution that came to be promulgated in September 1791 effectively transferred power to an assembly in the name of the people. Crucially, it was assumed that if a people were sovereign, then this was a sufficient condition to ensure that it was free and therefore that the rights of the individual would be protected. Accordingly, those framing the Constitution paid scant attention to the need for a separation or balance of powers. The die was now cast for what was to follow. The Constitution of 1791, retaining the monarchy, died stillborn. The Jacobin Constitution of 1793 reaffirmed the sovereignty of the people and did so by granting them the rights to both insurrection and legislative veto. Distrustful of the very process of representation, Robespierre's ambition was to fashion a new assembly which would be pure, incorruptible, peopled by virtuous men. Private, local, or sectional interest was equated with faction and opposition to the revolution. The English constitutional model was deemed fit only for a nation of slaves. With the constitution suspended until the return of peace, France then experienced revolutionary government, and with that came the rapid descent into the reign of terror, an experiment which only came to an end with the execution of the Jacobin leadership. After Thermidor, there followed a further attempt to establish the Republic upon a secure foundation, largely through the introduction of a complex set of executive and legislative arrangements designed to limit the exercise of popular sovereignty. A much-reduced suffrage giving power to the proper-tied classes was combined with two legislative chambers. For example, the Constitution of 1795 proved only slightly more enduring than its two predecessors. Assailed from all sides, the Directory of 5 members it spawned was reduced to increasingly desperate and unconstitutional measures in its determination to keep hold of power. No sooner was he elected to its membership than Size began, with typical calculation, to plot its overthrow. His protégé, the young Napoleon Bonaparte, duly performed the necessary act. With the coup d'état of the 18 Brumaire, technically the Republic still existed, although in 1802 Bonaparte had himself proclaimed consul for life, further extending his already considerable powers and reducing the power of the legislative branch. At this point, as Jacques Godchot remarked, Napoleon was already more powerful than Louis XIV. Godchot, 1995, page 166.
2.
Years later, Napoleon crowned himself emperor. In this way did the experience of the First Republic reach its sorry conclusion, the doctrine of popular sovereignty not only having eluded embodiment in a stable constitutional form but now associated as a consequence with Jacobin terror and Bonapartist dictatorship. It was against this depressing backdrop that writer after writer sought to draw lessons for France's future. If those like Joseph de Maistre and Louis de Bonald concluded that the whole experience had been an almost satanic enterprise and that there was no alternative but to return to the dual and unchallengeable authority of throne and altar, there were others, such as D'Estot de Tracy and his fellow ideologues who sought to reduce the radical potential of the language of rights by developing a more consistently utilitarian conception of liberty. Still others endeavored, against the odds, to formulate an understanding of liberty and of constitutional government that would be appropriate to a modern, commercial age. In the 19th century, such people were to be characterized as liberals. Properly to understand this frame of mind, we need first to return to the 18th century, and in particular to Montesquieu. Much has been written about Montesquieu's discussion of the English Constitution, and in particular about the vexed question of whether he was providing a description of how the English Constitution actually worked or an ideal type of the Constitution of Liberty. Montesquieu, 1989, pages 156 to 66. Whatever the answer, it is beyond dispute that Montesquieu sketched out what he took to be a tripartite division of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, and that he saw England as a system of mixed government, in which power was shared between monarch, lords, and commons.
From
this he concluded that a system of division and balance was indispensable for the preservation of liberty, and that the essence of good government was not only moderation but also a system which recognized that power must check power by the arrangement of things. Montesquieu, 1989, page 155. The worst of all situations, as evidenced by the Ottoman Empire, was one where the enjoyment of liberty depended upon the caprice of the legislator. Montesquieu, 1989, page 155, and upon the arbitrary power of the despot. Just as importantly, Montesquieu recognized, like Voltaire and others before him, that the governing principle of societal relations was in the process of fundamental transition. The pursuit of glory was being replaced by the spirit of commerce. Commerce, Montesquieu wrote, cures destructive prejudices, and it is an almost general rule that everywhere there are mild customs there is commerce, and that everywhere there is commerce there are gentle mores. Montesquieu, 1989, page 338. The natural effect of commerce, in short, was to lead to peace. Moreover, commerce is related to the Constitution. Under a government by one, its aim is the provision of luxury. Under a government by many, it aims modestly and by dint of continuous effort to produce a level of wealth that will permeate across society. In short, Montesquieu wrote, one's belief that one's prosperity is more certain in these states makes one undertake everything, and because one believes that what one has acquired is secure, one dares to expose it in order to acquire more. Only the means for acquisition are at risk. Now men expect more of their fortune. Montesquieu, 1989, page 341.
It is here that
England again figured positively in Montesquieu's argument. England, he wrote, has always made its political interests give way to the interests of its commerce. Montesquieu, 1989, page 343. This in turn begged the question of whether France should seek to emulate the English experience and example. Such was the extent of Montesquieu's conviction that laws should be in tune with the spirit of the nation, that this seemed no more than a hypothetical question incapable of resolution, but it was nevertheless a question that would be repeatedly posed in the century following the publication of De l'Esprit de Lois. One conclusion could, however, be drawn for certain. The liberty of the individual was best preserved through the contrived balance of governmental institutions and competing social interests, each grounded upon the mores engendered by commerce. Participants in the Revolution of 1789 did not hesitate from citing both Montesquieu and Rousseau, sometimes almost in the same breath. However, the rejection of the constitutional proposals of the monarchians, as Bernard Manin has observed, marked the defeat of the teachings of Montesquieu taken in their entirety. Manin 1992, page 329. For the next few years, as the idea of using the state as a moral agent in pursuit of the creation of a new man, Ossoff 1989, pages 116 to 57, gained in popularity. The moderation associated with a system of balances and contrived institutional equilibrium had little purchase upon public debate. It was nevertheless in this decade that a young Benjamin Constant began the publication of a series of pamphlets that sought to draw lessons from the experience of revolution. By general agreement, Constant's reflections on politics start to reach their maturity around 1806, the year in which he began writing his Principes de politiques applicables to les governments. His early essays define his pro-republican but anti-Jacobin position, and do so often by making the comparison between the English experience of revolution in 1660 and 1688 and that of France in 1789. Arbitrary power, he concluded, is the great threat to liberty, the corrupting vice of all institutions, the deadly germ that one can neither mutate nor moderate, but which must be destroyed. Constant 1797, page 94. Constant supported the Directory on the grounds that it was the regime most likely to terminate the revolution, and he was briefly reconciled to the consulate, but by 1802 his opposition to Napoleon Bonaparte was such that he was effectively forced into exile. It would be both easy and tempting to conclude that the defining experience for constitutional liberalism in France was that of the descent of the revolution into the nightmare of the Reign of Terror. Constant's essay of 1797, Des effets de la terreur, might seem proof enough. Such a conclusion would be unwisely to ignore the impact of the Bonapartist regime upon the thinking of French liberals. What Constant perceived, arguably before anyone else, was the sheer novelty of this form of government. It was not to be confused with either monarchy or the despotism of the past. It was rather an example of government as usurpation. Here, for example, is his comparison between the monarchy of England and the Bonapartist regime. In the former, we see that all the rights of citizens are safe from attack. Notwithstanding some abuses, more apparent than real, that popular elections keep the body politic alive, that freedom of the press is respected while talent is assured of its triumph, and that, in individuals of all classes, there is the proud, calm security of the man protected by the law of his country. Constant 1988 c. 1814, page 163. This, by contrast, is Constant's account of what is to be expected under the regime of a usurper. Usurpation exacts an immediate abdication in favor of a single individual. Treachery, violence, and perjury are routinely resorted to. Injustice and illegality become the norm. The usurper engages in incessant warfare and is forced to abase all those around him for fear that they may become his rivals. More than this, in one important respect, usurpation was even more hateful than absolute despotism. Usurpation, in parodying liberty, demanded the assent and the homage of the enslaved. Despotism, Constant wrote, rules by means of silence and leaves man the right to be silent. Usurpation condemns him to speak. It pursues him to the intimate sanctuary of his thoughts and, forcing him to lie to his own conscience, deprives the oppressed of his last remaining
Consolation. Constant 1988 Pepe 967.
Crucially, Constant believed that usurpation could not long survive for the simple reason that, in an age of commerce, it would look increasingly like an anachronism. As war had lost both its charm and its utility, so the sole aim of modern nations is repose, and with repose comfort, and as the source of comfort, industry. Constant 1988 c. page 54. Nevertheless, it was to this condition that France had been reduced, and this, Constant believed, was because the liberty which was offered to men at the end of the last century was borrowed from the ancient republics. Constant 1988 c. page 102. It is for this argument that Constant has become best known. Although found in many of Constant's writings, the key text is his essay
De la liberté des anciens comparée à celle des modernes, first Jivant à lecture.
In 1819, Constant 1988b, pages 307 to 28. Since we live in modern times, Constant proclaimed, I want a liberty suited to modern times. Constant 1988b, page 323. As the ambition of the moderns was the enjoyment of security in modern pleasures, it followed that liberty should be defined in terms of the guarantees accorded by institutions to these pleasures.
Constant 1988b, pp 311.
Although found in many of Constant's writings, the key text is his essay De la liberté des anciens comparée à celle des modernes, first given as a lecture in 1819, Constant 1988b, pages 307 to 28. Since we live in modern times, Constant proclaimed, I want a liberty suited to modern times. Constant 1988b, page 323. As the ambition of the moderns was the enjoyment of security in modern pleasures, it followed that liberty should be defined in terms of the guarantees accorded by institutions to these pleasures. Constant 1988b, pages 310 to 11. Accordingly, modern liberty consisted of ancient liberty. By contrast, consisted in exercising collectively but directly several parts of the complete sovereignty, in deliberating in the public square, in voting laws, in pronouncing judgments. Constant 1988b, page 323. This collective freedom, Constant argued, countenanced the complete subjection of the individual to the authority of the community. Constant 1988b, page 311. All private actions were subject to a severe surveillance. The individual was constrained, watched over, and repressed, a slave in all his private relations. Constant's next point was to suggest that we could no longer enjoy the liberty of the ancients and, furthermore, that it could be transposed to the modern age only at our peril. By seeking to do so, Rousseau in particular, Mably is also cited, had furnished deadly pretexts for more than one kind of tyranny. Constant 1988b, page 318. Read thus. Constant appears as a defender of a purely negative concept, tyranny of liberty, a view confirmed by his statement elsewhere that there is of necessity a part of human existence which remains individual and independent, and which is of right beyond social control. The truth of the matter, as Stephen Holmes has commented, is that though Constant had no illusions about modern freedom, he saw no alternative to it. Radically communal alternatives seemed less attractive still. Holmes 1984, page 14. His concern was that in an age of commerce, we would completely abandon the active participation in public power, and that consequently we should surrender our right to share in political power too easily. Holmes 1984, page 14. The not insubstantial challenge, therefore, was that we should renounce neither kind of liberty but rather learn to combine the two together. As Constant announced in the last paragraph of his speech, institutions must achieve the moral education of the citizens. Holmes 1984, page 14.
Governments, in
short, had both to respect the rights and independence of individuals whilst at the same time encouraging them to exercise influence over public affairs. How best such a state of affairs might be realized became the abiding preoccupation of the last 2 decades of Constant's life.
To begin, what
meaning did Constant attach to the idea that individuals possessed rights? Stephen Holmes, 1984, pages 53-4, has correctly observed that Constant endorsed a contextual theory of individual rights. Rights were not timeless ideals, but had arisen within the cultural and institutional environment of modern society. This did not diminish their importance as mechanisms capable of affording protection to both individuals and society from oppressive government. This was most clear in Constant's repeated rejection of Bentham's utilitarian critique of the language of natural and inalienable
rights.
To subject rights to the principle of utility, he argued, was like subjecting the eternal rules of arithmetic to our daily interests. Holmes, 1984.
pp. 53-4.
Actions became the outcome of selfish calculation rather than moral duty, and nothing, least of all the appeal to utility, could excuse a man who assisted a law he believed to be iniquitous, a judge who sat in a court he knew to be illegal, or a henchman who arrested someone he knew to be innocent. Citizens, Constant declared, possess individual rights independently of all social and political authority, and any authority which violates these rights becomes illegitimate. Constant, 1988a, page 180. Constant further specified these rights to be those of individual and religious liberty, freedom of speech, the possession of property, and protection from arbitrary interference. Next, Constant broke with the conception of power that had informed both the absolute monarchy of the Ancien regime and the worst excesses of the Revolution. In constructing a form of government which would respect these rights, he believed limits had to be placed not upon a particular form of sovereignty, but upon sovereignty itself. This was no truer than in the case of the sovereignty of the people. Those who in good faith had bestowed it with boundless power had made the mistake of focusing their anger upon the former holders of power rather than upon the nature of power itself. Rather than destroying unlimited sovereignty, they had simply replaced it and given it a new and, in truth, more dangerous form. The universality of citizens, Constant wrote, is sovereign in the sense that no individual, no faction, no partial association can arrogate sovereignty to itself, unless it has been delegated to it. But it does not follow from this that the universality of the citizens, or those who are invested with the sovereignty of them, can dispose sovereignly of the existence of individuals. Constant, 1988a.
pp. 176-7.
In terms of theory, the principal culprits were Hobbes and Rousseau. This argument led Constant to an important conclusion. The vice of almost all constitutions, he wrote, has been to fail to create a neutral power, and to place instead the total sum of power with which such a power ought to be invested in one of the active powers. Constant, 1988a, page 185. The particular strength of a constitutional monarchy, therefore, was not that it was separated into 3 branches, as Montesquieu had believed, but rather that it was distinguished by the existence of 5 powers: royal power, executive power, hereditary power, a popularly elected assembly, and an independent judiciary. Royal power was a neutral power in the sense that the monarch had no other interest than that of the maintenance of order and liberty. Royal power as such was, above the 4 others, a superior, and at the same time intermediate authority, with no interest in disturbing the balance. Constant, 1988a, page 185. Liberty was preserved because royal power could ensure that none of the 4 active powers gained an exclusive hold over the authority of the state. This reality, Constant affirmed, could be found in the English monarchy. Constant perceived several other distinct advantages from such a system of constitutional monarchy. Ministers were responsible, not just before the law, but before the tribunal of public opinion. Openness of parliamentary debate would engender a spirit of inquiry and a constant participation in public affairs. Constant 1988a, page 239. The independence of the judiciary, trial by jury, and a constant and scrupulous respect for due procedure would offer protection to the innocent. Liberty of the press would subject authority to informed criticism and publicity. The army, reduced to its proper function of repelling foreign invaders, would no longer pose a threat to individual liberty. Most importantly, Constant recommended the independence of municipal and local authorities. Here was a fundamental truth. Until now, local power has been regarded as a dependent branch of executive power. On the contrary, although it must never encroach upon the latter, it must by no means depend upon it. Constant 1988a, pages 251-2. If this truth is ignored, general laws are badly implemented and partial interests poorly protected. Municipal power, in short, needed to be more than a mere ghost, thereby preserving the liberty of the life of groups, their internal arrangements, enjoying perfect independence for as long as they do not harm the whole collectivity. Similarly, Constant was emphatic that of all the liberties that warranted protection, amongst the most important was religious liberty. The prescription of religion, he argued, always caused harm. Even more controversially, he continued by arguing that the multitude of sects of which some are so frightened is precisely what is most healthy for religion, and therefore, by implication, for society. Constant 1988a, page 285. Such a system of constitutional government, Constant believed, would provide the positive safeguards and bastions capable of guaranteeing the liberty of the individual and of protecting against the arbitrary power that would destroy morality, security, and commerce. What prevents arbitrary power, he concluded, is the observance of procedures. Procedures alone protect innocence. Everything else is obscure. Everything is handed over to solitary conscience and vacillating opinion. Procedures alone are fully in evidence. It is to them alone that the oppressed may appeal. Constant. 1988a, page 292. Yet there clearly had to be more to constitutional government than the exercise of a neutral power and the existence of constitutional procedures, guaranteeing individual and local freedoms. At the heart of the debates that had structured the revolutionary decade had been a disagreement about the politics of representation. Was it the monarch or the people who spoke for the nation? Constant veered towards an intermediary position, importantly, denying any one person or category this exclusive privilege. He defended a hereditary chamber possessing constitutional and well-determined prerogatives as a means of counterbalancing a popularly elected chamber. As for the latter body, Constant was convinced that, if its membership was to be decided upon by direct election, then it should also rest upon a property qualification. It is desirable, Constant wrote, that representative offices should generally be occupied by men, if not from the wealthy classes, at least in easy circumstances. Constant 1988a, page 212. Leisure alone made possible the acquisition of understanding, and therefore property made men capable of exercising political rights. Less easy to specify was the precise nature of the appropriate property qualification, especially with regard to the relative merits of landed and industrial property. Of two things, however, Constant was certain. Property as such was inviolable, and during the Revolution literary men, mathematicians, chemists, separated as they were from the lives of other men, had indulged in the most exaggerated opinions. The liberal professions, he concluded, needed to be connected to property in order to ensure that their impact upon political debate was not again to prove destructive. Constant 1988a, page 220. These views were formulated by Constant in the years following 1806, and they continued to inform his writings and actions in the years until his death in 1830. Upon Napoleon's return to France in 1814, he somewhat unwisely offered to write a new constitution for the emperor, and then, with the return of the monarchy and the granting of the new constitutional charter, found himself repeatedly seeking to push the political order of the Restoration in a liberal direction. In 1822, Constant reaffirmed many of
his guiding principes unissant du lit neglected commentaire sur l'ouvrage de
Phalangieri. The functions of government, he wrote, are negative. It should repress evil and leave the good to operate by itself. Constant 2004, page 316. The general motto of all governments, he concluded, should be laissez-faire
et laissez-passer.
3. The Doctrinaires. The most important recent analysis of the character of French liberal
ISM, Lucien Jomès L'individu face ou le paradoxe du libéralisme franc.
Jom 1997 seeks to establish a threefold typology which distinguishes distinct traditions within liberalism in France. The third, and in our context, least important tradition is that of Catholic liberalism. Associated with the names of Lamennais and Montalembert, it sought to reconcile the claims of the Catholic Church with those of a state. The first, and according to Jom, minority tradition is one that stressed the constitutional protection of individual rights, if necessary, against the state. Its leading representatives, according to Jom, were Germain de Staël, Constant, and later Alexis de Tocqueville and Anatole Prévost-Paradol. It advocated a liberalism of the subject. The dominant tradition, according to Jom, was that associated with Francois Guizot, the so-called Doctrinaires, and the Orleanist Galaxy. This tradition stressed the importance of governability and the subordinate tie-in of the individual to the state. When expressed philosophically, as in the writings of Victor Cousin, it amounted to a form of anti-individualism. It was a liberalism of the notables. Moreover, it was this liberalism that guided the politics of the July monarchy, 1830–48, and which informed the institutional compromise of 1875 that so effectively established the Third Republic upon a conservative basis. As a consequence, this account suggests liberalism became associated in the French mind with the supremacy of the upper bourgeoisie, and it is this which in part explains the failure of liberalism in France. There is much to be recommended in Jom's detailed reconstruction of the universe of 19th-century French liberalism. It is true that liberalism came in different forms, and that the voice of liberals like Constant was often drowned out by those who came to hold power during the July monarchy. It is true, too, that the collapse of that regime in 1848 left liberalism and its representatives with a reputation for corruption, incompetence, and repression. Yet it could be argued that Jom both underestimates the achievements of Guizot and his colleagues, especially in the field of catinal reform, and that he overemphasizes the differences between the two main traditions. In particular, as recent works by Criotu and Garnett illustrate, Criotu 2003, Garnett 2003, such a sharp distinction ignores the impact that the Doctrinaires had upon Tocqueville. Not only did Tocqueville attend Guizot's lectures at the Sorbonne between April 1828 and May 1830, but it was from him that he came to realize, amongst many other things, that society was moving irresistibly towards an equality of conditions. For this reason alone we ought, if only briefly, to consider the views of this remarkable and unduly neglected group of men. The Doctrinaires were writers, scholars, and men of action, throwing themselves into the political fray for 3 decades or more. They were historians who realized that there could be no return to the Ancien Regime, and that the France of the Restoration was the product of a long evolution of European society. As Charles de Remusat remarked, the French Revolution was in no way an accident, but rather the necessary outcome of the entire past century. Remusat 2003, page 39. They were, for the most part, Anglophiles, believing not that English institutions could be transported wholesale to France, but that much could be learned from English history and political practices. They also saw that a new France had emerged, a France divested of privilege and of absolutism, and moreover that a new means of government was required for this new order. This, to refer again to Remusat, was to be the science of constitutional government, and at its heart was to be the representative system. Remusat 2003, page 77. See also Remusat 1860.
pp 276-328.
The doctrinaires labored long and hard to elucidate both the principles and the practices of such a system of government and representation.
They
did so in the face of constant opposition from those who sought to make a return to the old order. Crucially, they also did so from the floor of the parliamentary chamber, frequently carrying the argument despite their insignificant number. From the outset, they opposed the spirit of party, recognizing both that in France the existence of parties had preceded the advent of representative government, and that this had contributed to the excesses associated with the popular assemblies of the revolutionary era. Against their opponents, they struggled to impose and to assert their interpretation of the Constitutional Charter of 1814 as a text which could be read as the foundation of a constitutional and parliamentary monarchy. Given the ambiguities of the text and the fact that it had been graciously conceded to France by a benign Louis XVIII, this was to prove a far from easy task. Their most eloquent advocate was Pierre-Paul Royer-Collard, c. Royer-Collard 1861. A philosopher by training, Royer-Collard taught at the Sorbonne from 1811 to 1814. In 1815, he was elected deputy for the Marne and remained in this office until 1839. His parliamentary addresses focused upon many themes, but he returned repeatedly to the subject of representation, famously arguing that the word itself was to be understood, at best, as a metaphor. "We have had," Royer-Collard commented, "the sad privilege of having learned what nations gain from being fully and wholly represented. The Revolution was nothing else than the doctrine of representation in action." Royer-Collard 1861, page 231. In other words, not only would a truly representative system prove to be extremely dangerous, but in the absence of universal suffrage and a binding mandate upon those elected it was entirely incorrect, a lie, a chimera, Royer-Collard proclaimed, to imagine that an elected deputy could be described as a representative of the people. As such, the deputy could be said to represent neither the will of the electors nor their opinions. The deputy had a function to perform, namely that of deliberating freely and without the restraints of party upon the interests of the country, and to that extent the function of the elector was to choose a person capable of performing that role. The right to cast a vote, therefore, had to be based upon the possession of an appropriate aptitude and independence in the elector. Of necessity, this entailed a limited franchise. Royer-Collard's doubts about turning the direction of government over to the vagaries of popular opinion and the sovereignty of the people were such that he initially denied the wisdom of leaving the composition of government to the discretion of an elected chamber. On that day, he announced, in 1816, "We shall be in a republic." Royer-Collard 1861, page 217. With time, he softened his position, acknowledging the principle of ministerial responsibility before the Chamber of Deputies. In 1830, it was Royer-Collard who presented the so-called Address of the 221 protesting at the abuse of power by Charles X, thereby precipitating the subsequent revolution. Nevertheless, what remained unchanged was his central conviction that over and against the sovereignty of the people had to be posited the sovereignty of Arié, son, and that this was best realized through the institutionalization of stable, constitutional government. It was this latter theme that was taken up most persuasively by Frank Oas Guizot in a stream of writings from 1816 onwards, see Rosenbalen, 1985. He approached it from at least three angles: the philosophical, the historical, and the sociological. The philosophical aspect of Guizot's argument was best expressed in an unpublished and unfinished text entitled Philosophie politique de la souveraineté, written between 1822 and 1823, Guizot 1985, pages 305-89. Contradicting Rousseau, he argued that the will of the individual should not be the source of a sovereign's legitimacy and power, because if this was so, the outcome would be the dissolution of society itself. Moreover, it was palpably absurd to believe that man should be absolute master over himself, that his will should be his legitimate sovereign, that at no time and by no right does anyone have power over him if he does not consent. Constant 1988a, page 366. In Guizot's opinion, it should rather be the case that the solitary will of the individual should be constrained by the eternal dictates of reason, truth, justice. Only a government which conformed to the laws of reason could be legitimate. The argument from history drew upon several distinct sources.
Guizot's
Histoire de la Civilisation and Europe, Guizot 1985, 1846, initially given as a set of lectures and one of his most widely read and influential texts, set out the broad framework of interpretation. The advance of European civilization, he argued, had been characterized by two overarching trends: the emergence of nation-states and the emancipation of the individual from religious tutelage. The evident tension between the two, between the practice of centralization and the principle of liberty, was to be resolved through representative government. By way of example, Guizot explored in intricate detail the evolution of representative government in medieval England, Guizot 2002, pages 328-38. Here, he contended, had been an electoral system that had summoned every capable citizen to its ranks, thereby gathering together the scattered and incomplete fragments of reason that were dispersed throughout society. From this experience, he drew three important conclusions. The principle that attached electoral participation to capacity was universal in nature. Nevertheless, the definition of capacity would change over time. The English electoral system, for example, had become unjust at the moment when it ceased to embrace all those capability of exercising political rights. Thus, electoral law should respond to the emergence of new capabilities as they become known within society. The precise details of the electoral arrangements preferred by Guizot can be passed over, but it followed from the above that the proper object of election was to bring forth the most capable and best accredited men in the country, thereby bringing to light the true, the legitimate aristocracy. The explicit assumption was that it would be in this way that public reason and public morality would be realized and brought together to constitute a government. Power, Guizot wrote, is only legitimate in so far as it is conform to reason. Guizot 2002, page 296. Guizot devoted considerable attention to the exploration of the course of English history, Guizot 1826-7, 2002. He saw clearly that its medieval representative system had been overturned by the rise of the despotic Tudor monarchs and that it had taken 50 years of political revolution from 1640 to 1688 to re-establish the ascendancy of the commons. This in turn had led to the rise to political prominence of a new commercial class and to the dominance of a reformed religion which recognized liberty of conscience. Out of this had flowed free government and abundant prosperity. Guizot, like nearly all his fellow French liberals, was always alive to the contrasts and comparisons with France afforded by the English experience. It is, he wrote, the examination of the causes that in England have determined the success of the representative system, which seems to me to be the shortest and safest way of explaining their failure in our land. Guizot 1823, page 371. From the 13th century to the present, everything in land had tended towards the triumph of parliamentary government, whilst in France everything had tended towards the triumph of pure monarchy. Guizot 1823, pages 511-17. This in turn provided fertile terrain for comparisons between 1688 and 1789, with the doctrinaires in general believing that the French Revolution would only come to an end when, as an own land, liberty had been given a secure and durable institutional framework. In Guizot's eyes, 1789 had marked the culmination of a war between what had amounted to two distinct peoples within French society, and as such it denoted the triumph of equality over privilege and of the Third Estate over the nobility. The revolution, of course, had been derailed by the theorists of popular sovereignty, but in these two achievements lay its legacy. Here was the clue to the sociological dimension of Guizot's argument. For all his admiration of the achievements of England, Guizot saw grounds for optimism with regard to France, and he did so because the account of French history he offered was premised upon the ultimate triumph of the middle classes. It was this group that had emerged out of the process of revolution as that which represented the new interests in French society. Unlike the aristocracy, it was not a closed caste but an open and expanding class capable of absorbing all those with the talent and determination to enrich France both materially and spiritually. Its interests thus coincided with the broad interests of France as a whole. It embodied public reason. The intention of a representative system of government, therefore, was to grant power to new superiorities who will prove that they merit it and who will exercise it in the interest of those people who have come to accept them. Guizot 1821, page 165. The argument ran along the following lines. It was not a question of deciding what was the best form of government in the abstract, but rather of deciding what form of government was most appropriate in the circumstances. For the new France, according to Guizot and his fellow doctrinaires, this was representative government. How did this feed into the argument for constitutional government? If representative government embodied the sovereignty of reason, it also gave form to another vital principle, the radical illegitimacy of all absolute power. Guizot 2002, page 226. The art of politics and the secret of liberty, according to Guizot, lay in the provision of equals for every power for which it cannot provide superiors, as all power without equals would soon become absolute. This end was to be attained by a variety of means. First came a recognition of the individual rights of citizens. These would allow individuals to superintend, control, and limit the activities of the central supreme power. Amongst these rights, Guizot gave priority to freedom of the press and what he described as publicity of all kinds. Next came the distinct and independent existence of such secondary powers as municipal and judicial authorities. Finally, and most importantly, Guizot recommended the organization of the central power itself in such a manner as to make it very difficult for it to usurp rightful omnipotence. Here Guizot principally had in mind the division of legislative power into two chambers and the separation of legislative and executive power. Guizot 2002, pages 371-6. Guizot, in short, appended a theory of representative government as the sovereignty of reason to what amounted to a modified version of a balance and separation of powers argument. In broad political terms, during the period of the Restoration, Guizot and his fellow doctrinaires sought to ensure that the Constitutional Charter of 1814 was implemented along these lines. Their ambition was to steer a course between monarchical reaction and revolutionary republicanism, to establish a just milieu based upon order, legality, and constitutional liberty. In this they were fighting against the odds, especially after the arrival on the throne of Charles X in 1824. However, in 1830 the old order was to come crashing to the ground. Louis Philippe was crowned King of the French. The constitutional charter was revised so as to reduce royal prerogatives and extend the electorate, and the revolution again appeared to be over. More than this, Guizot and his colleagues were now effectively to dominate French politics for the next 18 years, Rosenvallen 1994.
4. Alexis de Tocqueville.
Before we consider the important contribution made by Alexis de Tocqueville to constitutional liberalism in France, one final aspect of the thinking of the doctrinaires needs to be highlighted. We have already seen that, according to Guizot, the course of European civilization had been characterized by the rise of the nation-state. This had meant the centralization of government, especially in France. Pierre Rosenvallen has argued that the doctrinaires were not against centralization per se, but rather that they wished to establish a new type of centralization appropriate to a society where it was no longer possible to dissociate the center from the periphery, civil society from the state, local power from central power. Rosenvallen. O 1985, pp 59-60. Nevertheless, they were alive to the damaging and detrimental impact of the administrative centralization associated with the Ancien
Régime.
If this is evident in the work of Guizot, so it is clearly visible in the parliamentary speeches of Royer Collard and the writings of Remusat and of Prosper de Baranti.
The l'ATS des communes et de l'aristocratie described.
Not only the crushing of the communes by centralized, monarchical power, but praised local government on the grounds that it provided the opportunity to deliberate and decide upon issues of immediate and particular concern, gave citizens strength and wisdom, freed them from isolation and apathy, and taught people to know and to love public order. Baranti. O 1921, pp 8-9. Moreover, it provided an indispensable schooling for the affairs of life in a free society. This defense of local government, it should be noted, preceded that offered more famously by Tocqueville by more than a decade. It was when the likes of Baranti came to consider the practicalities entailed in reinvigorating local institutions that the scale of the problem they faced became most evident. On this account, the monarchy of the Ancien Régime had progressively and successfully deprived the aristocracy of its historic functions, producing the intellectual, moral, and spiritual impoverishment of France. Hope, however, lay in rekindling practices of association, and, in line with the general position of the doctrinaires, in the emergence of a new aristocracy of social superiors. Some continued to look longingly towards English traditions of self-government. Tocqueville, on the other hand, found another model in America. Tocqueville visited America for 10 months between April 1831 and February 1832, see Pearson 1996, Schleifer 1980. The first volume of De La Démocratie NAM Eric appeared in 1835, the second in 1840. There has for long been a debate about the level of continuity and discontinuity between the two texts, with some critics going as far as to suggest that there occurred a radical change in perspective. Drescher 1964. Lamberti 1989. Of late, doubt has been cast about how much Tocqueville actually saw and knew of the country with which his name is now irredeemably associated. He knew little of American industrial life, and probably even less about the South. Wills 2004. Nor, indeed, can De La Démocratie and A.M. Eric be properly regarded as a major work of political theory in the conventional sense. It lacks terminological clarity and is frequently ambiguous in its conclusions. Nevertheless, the hyperbolic praise has continued. Two of its recent editors felt able to announce that Democracy in America is at once the best book ever written on democracy and the best book ever written on America. Mansfield and Winthrop 2000, page 17. In Tocqueville's words, De La Démocratie and A.M. Eric was written under the pressure of a sort of religious terror in the author's soul. That terror was produced by the sight of an irresistible revolution that for so many centuries has marched over all obstacles and that one still sees advancing today amid the ruins it has made. In short, a great democratic revolution, characterized by the gradual development of equality of conditions, was taking place. This fundamental transformation of society, Tocqueville insisted, was a providential fact. It is universal, it is enduring, each day. It escapes human power. The grave danger, however, was that through ignorance of the nature of this process, democracy had been abandoned to its savage instincts. We have democracy, Tocqueville announced, without anything to attenuate its vices. With this in mind, Tocqueville arrived in America, not only to satisfy his curiosity, but also to find lessons there, from which we could profit. Once there he saw more than America.
Tocqueville dormi, pp. 3:15.
Here, in brief, are the essential elements of Tocqueville's argument.
In
America, men are more equal in wealth and in intelligence than anywhere else in the world. The aristocratic element has been destroyed to the point of extinction, and thus it could be said that the people govern in the United
States.
The principle of the sovereignty of the people dominated all aspects of American society. By dint of circumstance, this had produced conciliatory government, founded upon the enlightened will of the people and the moderate and responsible behavior of individual citizens. Yet, although the form of government is representative, it is evident that the opinions, the prejudices, the interests, and even the passions of the people can find no lasting obstacles that prevent them from taking effect in the daily direction of social life. Tocqueville 2000, page 165. Herein lay a potential problem of enormous magnitude, the tyranny of the majority. In America, this could take a variety of forms. It is of the very essence of democratic governments, Tocqueville wrote, that the empire of the majority is absolute. Tocqueville 2000, page 235. The interests of the many were to be preferred to the interests of the few, and the people had a right
to do anything they wished.
The dire and dangerous consequences of this were as follows. It increased legislative instability because the majority insisted its desires be indulged rapidly and irresistibly in the form of law. It likewise favored the arbitrariness of the magistrate because the majority, being an absolute master in making the law and in overseeing its execution, having equal control over those who govern and over those who are governed, regards public officials as its passive agents. Tocqueville 2000, page 243. Most importantly, the tyranny of the majority existed as a moral force exercised over opinion. I do not know of any country, Tocqueville wrote, where less independence of mind and genuine freedom of discourse shall reign than in America. The majority drew a formidable circle around thought. Tocqueville 2000, page 243. If then freedom was ever to be lost in America, the fault would lie with the omnipotence of the majority. Yet to date, Tocqueville argued, the effect of the tyranny of the majority had had little influence upon political society, the distressing effects being limited to its impact upon the national character of Americans. This was so because the threat of democratic despotism was curtailed by the existence of a series of all-important constitutional limitations upon majoritarian power. First amongst these was the federal system of government, the division of the legislative body into two branches, and the existence of an independent, if weak, executive. Next came the absence of administrative centralization, and with that the inability of central government to regulate secondary things in society. Even if it had the desire to do so, government could not make all citizens in all places, in the same manner, at the same moment, bend to its desires. Tocqueville 2000, page 250. The third counterbalance came in the form of judicial power and the character of the legal profession.
In a
democratic society, lawyers, possessing the tastes and habits of aristocracy, formed the sole enlightened class that the people do not distrust. If they prized freedom, they placed legality before it, fearing arbitrariness more than they feared tyranny. They were the natural friends of order and the opponents of innovation, and thus had a tendency to neutralize the vices inherent in popular government. More than this, they had the right to declare laws to be unconstitutional. The judge, Tocqueville wrote, cannot force people to make laws, but at least he constrains them not to be unfaithful to their own laws and to remain in accord with themselves. Tocqueville. 2000, page 257. There was, however, an important non-constitutional element to the protection of freedom. America was in part preserved from the tyranny of the majority by the manners and customs of the people. This had several dimensions. For example, Tocqueville commented upon the public spirit of Americans and their respect for the law, but he focused in particular upon the impact of religion upon American life. Antoine, 2003. Religion acted to elevate the aspirations of the majority, whilst at the same time diminutive, issuing the element of caprice in their actions. Religion among Americans, Tocqueville concluded, should therefore be considered as the first of their political institutions, for if it does not give them the taste for freedom, it singularly facilitates their use of it. Tocqueville, 2000, page 280. What lessons could be drawn from this American experience for Europe, and for France in particular? On this, Tocqueville was unambiguous. Hammer. ICA proved that one should not despair over democracy, and that it could be regulated for the better by laws and by social customs. However, Tocqueville did not contend that France should simply copy America, but he did believe that, unless France could succeed in gradually introducing democratic institutions and in securing the peaceful empire of the greatest number, then, sooner or later, a people with no experience of freedom would fall under the unlimited power of one alone. The stark choice, in other words, was between democratic freedom or the tyranny of the Caesars. Tocqueville. Domi, pp. 298-302. All of the above appeared in Volume 1. 5 years later, the second volume received less critical acclaim. There was undoubtedly a subtle change in tone. Increasingly alert to the enthusiasm of Americans for physical well-being, Tocqueville now provided a more somber appraisal of the character of democratic man. Individualism, the reflective and peaceable sentiment that disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of those like him and to withdraw to one side with his family and friends, was his chief characteristic and vice. Tocqueville, 2000, page 482. At first it sapped the source of public virtues, but in time it produced outright selfishness. Gone were the common bonds that held society together. However, the Americans, according to Tocqueville, had combated individualism and had defeated it. They had done this through the practice of association in civil life. Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all persuasions, Tocqueville wrote, constantly unite. Through this they acquired the habit of pursuing activities in common and became aware of the interests they shared with others. The art of association, therefore, taught people the all-important principle of self-interest well understood. This did not call forth heroic virtues or great acts of public virtue, but suggests little sacrifices each day, and forms a multitude of citizens who are regulated, temperate, moderate, far-sighted, masters of themselves. Tocqueville, 2000, page 502. Underlying this, however, was an awareness that despotism prospered in a situation characterized by the isolation of men and, therefore, that its emergence was particularly to be feared in democratic societies. Specifically, Tocqueville noticed that democratic societies were capable of producing a new form of despotism that was milder but more extensive than its predecessors, which would degrade men rather than torment them. Our leaders would resemble schoolmasters, and we would console ourselves with the thought that we had at least chosen them ourselves. State control would become ever more intrusive, and all initiative would be taken away from the private individual. The great cause of this growth of government activity was the development of industry. In 1839, Tocqueville entered Parliament, where for the most part he focused his attention upon foreign affairs and the French Empire, ing a commitment to the abolition of slavery with a defense of colonial expansion. From his private correspondence, we know that he continued to follow developments in America and that his admiration for American institutions was largely undiminished. Tocqueville 1990, Criotu and Jennings 2004. He became increasingly dissatisfied with the political affairs of the July monarchy and then, in 1848, found himself not only re-elected to serve in the Second Republic, but also at the very center of the constitutional debates which followed. Here we might briefly contrast the response of Guizot and Tocqueville to these events. Exiled in England, Guizot poured forth his venom in
De la démocratie en France, Guizot 1849.
France's greatest weakness, he argued, was that of democratic idolatry. Everywhere the individual liberty of citizens faced the single will embodied by the numerical majority of the nation, the result would be revolutionary despotism. It is this idea, Guizot wrote, that has to be eradicated, and this could be done by rallying all the conservative forces of social order to hold back the advancing tide. Tocqueville, on the other hand, defended a constitutional project that bore a striking resemblance to that of his monarchian forebears of 1789. His emphasis fell upon seeking to ensure, through a two-chamber system, that legislation was subject to scrutiny by different groups of people who would moderate the potentially impetuous and ill-advised actions of a single chamber possessed of the belief that it alone spoke in the name of the national will. Moreover, he persisted in arguing that France still had something to learn from American constitutional arrangements, Criotu and Jennings 2009, pages 382-4. Here, as with much else, he was to be disillusioned. The election to the presidency of Louis Napoleon led almost inevitably to the coup d'état of 1851. With this came Tocqueville's brief imprisonment and also the emergence of the precise species of despotic regime which he had for so long feared could be the product of democracy. He outward forms of popular election, he wrote to one of his American correspondents, had served only to establish a more absolute despotism than any other that has ever appeared in France. Criotu and Jennings 2009, page 133. The 1850s were bleak years for Tocqueville. In 1850, the first symptoms of the tuberculosis which killed him 9 years later were diagnosed. There remained only the task of writing his souvenirs and his final masterpiece.
L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, Tocqueville 1952-1856.
The basic argument of this famous text is well known. The centralized administration of France was not the creation of the Revolution of 1789, as many had believed, but the product of the old monarchical order. That regime had eliminated all intermediate authorities and stripped the provinces of local autonomy. Paris became the master of France. France was not only reduced to being the country in which men were most like each other, but also where people had been split up into small, independent, self-regarding groups. There was, Tocqueville wrote, a kind of collective individualism which prepared people for the real individualism with which we are familiar. Tocqueville, 1998, page 163. This was not to say that the French were prone to servile ity and subservience. The French were attached to freedom, but it was an ill-adjusted, intermittent, ill-assimilated, and unwholesome liberty to which they adhered. Necessary for the vital task of overthrowing despotism, such a mindset perhaps made them less capable than any other people have found. In its place the free and peaceable empire of the law. Tocqueville 1998. Page 179. Crucially, the desire for reform took precedence over the desire for freedom, whilst the absolute power of the state was seen as something to be used rather than destroyed. The French, Tocqueville continued, came to see the ideal society as a people without any aristocracy other than government officials, a single and all-powerful administration, director of the state, guardian of individuals, Tocqueville 1998, page 216. Hostility to religion also became a fierce and intolerant passion. It was this argument that allowed Tocqueville to provide his clearest definition of liberty. Liberty, he wrote, is the pleasure of being able to speak, act, and breathe without constraint, under the government of God and the laws alone. Tocqueville 1998, page 217. Second, liberty was to be valued as an end in itself. Whoever sought private gain from freedom was made for slavery. Third, therefore, liberty was not to be confused with a narrow individualism where all public virtues are smothered. Liberty alone could free men from a love of material well-being. The second part of the argument explored the impact of the failure properly to understand the nature of liberty upon the course and outcome of the revolution itself. In short, if the outbreak of revolution was inevitable, so too it was doomed to failure. Two passions, Tocqueville insisted, drove on the revolution: an intense hatred of inequality and the less powerful desire to live as free men. When the first virile generation of the revolution's leaders faded away, the ideal of freedom lost much of its appeal, and then the scene was set for the return of absolute government. We returned to centralization in its ruins, Tocqueville wrote, and restored it, and hence, from the very bowels of a nation the monarchy suddenly surged forth a power more extensive, more detailed, more absolute than that which any of our kings had exercised. Tocqueville 1998, page 245. Here then was a work of history written for deeply political purposes. Tocqueville's intention was to explain to his readers why it was that France had not been able to establish an enduring political regime characterized by the liberty of the individual. His short answer was that the French had come to prefer governments which flattered their desire for equality rather than those which gave them freedom, and thus they were ripe for despotism. Napoleon had fallen, but successive attempts to destroy absolutism had only succeeding in placing liberty's head upon a servile body. Tocqueville 1998, page 245. 5. Conclusion. Tocqueville concluded l'Ancien Régime et la our evolution with a statement to the effect that it was his intention next to study the revolution itself. We also know that he had plans to examine the empire and the manner in which Napoleon's project had been incorporated into French political culture. Neither was to see the light of day. Having briefly occupied the position of posthumous leader of the Liberal Party after 1870, Tocqueville was quickly forgotten. Melonio 1993. In the difficult political climate of the 1860s, the voice of liberalism could, however, still be heard. A work such as Odilon,
Barouès de la centralisation et de ses effets, published in 1861, continued to
voice traditional liberal concerns about an overmighty state, and did so by making explicit reference to the ideas of Montesquieu. Prévost Paradol's 1868 text, Law France Nouvelle, located his demands for the administrative and political reform of France within an undisguised admiration for English parliamentary and municipal practices. Most impressive of all was the work of Edouard Laboulaye, long an advocate of the merits of the American Constitution. See Laboulaye 1848-1850. Not only did he edit Constance
Major Political Writing, Buin l'État et ses limites and le Parti libéral, son
Programme et son avenir, both published in 1863, he reworked the latter's distinction between ancient and modern liberty as part of a self-conscious liberal tradition that ran from the monarchians to Tocqueville. In so doing, Laboulaye set out a liberal agenda for a new generation freed from the illusions and disappointments of the past, and one he announced that was a program for modern democracy. Nevertheless, it has been argued that the project of liberalism was inadequately attuned to the imperatives of the time, Hazarizing 1998, p. 229, and that it failed to capture the public imagination in a period when Public opinion was increasingly polarized. It is thus somewhat ironic that the constitutional compromise that came to mark the institutions of the Third Republic after 1875 was broadly in line with long-established liberal demands for a balance of power. It is only in the last 25 years or so that in France renewed attention has been devoted to the major figures of liberalism discussed in this chapter. Why this has been so in itself merits investigation. However, a century of neglect cannot diminish their astonishing originality and intellectual brilliance. It is easy to point out the naivete of their faith in bourgeois rule, their tendency towards aristocratic nostalgia for a society resting upon social hierarchy, as well as the political insensitivity of their criticisms of university or Sal suffrage, but by the same token, their great achievement was to realize, probably before anyone else, that democracy and equality of conditions could spawn an entirely novel type of despotism. In its mild form, it could take the shape of the tyranny of the majority, described by Tocqueville. Less benignly, it could take the character of the Bonapartist usurpation, described by Constant. Given France's post-1789 political turmoil, French liberals were best placed to discern the danger and ideally situated to reflect upon the constitutional mechanisms that might alleviate it. In so doing, they provided invaluable insights into the nature of modern politics.